Hi again. I want to talk to you today about can you see God's face? After I made that last video, I had some people ask me about, well, you said no one can see God's face and live. Where'd you get that from? Well, let's look at where I got that from. I got that from Exodus chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33 here, we see in verse 18 that Moses said, I beseech you, show me your glory. And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And he said, you cannot see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. And then verse 21, and the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand upon a rock. And it shall come to pass while my glory passes by that I will put you on the cleft of a rock, and I will cover you with my hand while I pass by. And I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back parts, but my face you shall not see. My face shall not be seen. So no one can see the face of God and live. It says right here, God said, you cannot see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. So that's why when God passed by Moses, he only let him see his back. You shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Then in chapter 34, in verse 4, it says, Moses hewed 2 tablets of stone like unto the first. Remember, the first 2 tablets were destroyed. This is the commandments. And Moses rose up early in the morning and went up to Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him. And he took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord descended in a cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed by before him, just like he said in chapter 33, and proclaimed the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. So no man can see the face of God and live. That's how we know Jacob did not wrestle with God. Obviously, he did not wrestle with God, or he couldn't have lived. And of course, he had no chance in the first place wrestling God. And that angel that he wrestled with could not prevail against him. So that just clarifies what I said last week about how you cannot see the face of God and live. Now, people point out other verses here, like in chapter 33, speaking of Moses. It says in verse 9, and it came to pass as Moses entered the tabernacle, the cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. And here we see the Lord talked with Moses, but he did it from a cloudy pillar. You couldn't see his face, obviously, or Moses wouldn't have lived. Verse 11 says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face. Well, that doesn't mean Moses saw his face. It means they spoke face to face. In other words, he was clouded, and Moses couldn't see his face, but yes, they spoke man to man, so to speak, face to face, as a man speaks unto his friend. So that doesn't tell us that Moses saw God's face. No, on the contrary, we saw later on that no one can see his face and live. For no man shall see me and live. You cannot see my face. So obviously here, when it says that the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, that means he did speak to him face to face, but Moses couldn't see him. It was a cloudy pillar that stood at the tabernacle door. The cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle. Now, if that was God, obviously he wouldn't have gone through the trouble of just having to show his backside. He says, you shall see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. Well, obviously there'd be no reason to do this if he was seeing God face to face this whole time. No, he wasn't. There was a cloudy pillar, and that's how Moses saw him while he was speaking to him, quote, face to face. In other words, he spoke to him face to face, but he couldn't see his face. Then in 1 Kings chapter 19, we see that Elijah also saw God pass by, but he didn't see his face. Here God said, go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord, and behold, the Lord passed by. And a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke to pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after that a still small voice, and God spoke through that still small voice. But you notice that God passed by. Once again, he did not show his face to Elijah. In Hebrews 1:3, we see that The Son, that's Jesus Christ, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. So Jesus is the exact representation of the Father's being, meaning he's not the Father. Jesus isn't the Father, otherwise he couldn't be a son. The fact that he's a son means he's not the Father, but he's the Son of the Father. But he's the exact representation of the Father's being. He was born of a woman so he could take human flesh and be visible and walk the earth as a man. And that is the closest representation we'll ever see of seeing God, was the fact when Jesus came to the earth, he was the exact representation of the Father's being, and everything he did reflected what God the Father is like. So that's why we see in Revelation, where in the end, at the time of the rapture in Revelation chapter 6, we see that the people called out in verse 16, at the sixth seal, they called out to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath is come, and who can stand? Now, what are they seeing? They're seeing Jesus. That's who comes down from out of heaven and meets the believers in the clouds. That's what they're seeing is Jesus, but they're also seeing that the temple is visible now in heaven, because it says in verse 14, and the heaven departed as a scroll when it was rolled together, and every mountain and island were removed out of their places. So the heaven is the firmament. In the Old Testament, in Genesis, we see that the heaven is the firmament. That's the barrier. It was the barrier that separated the waters that were above the heaven from the waters that were below the heaven. So the heaven was the barrier. So the heaven is the firmament. And it departed as a scroll when it was rolled together. So God's temple was seen in heaven. In Revelation chapter 11, at the time of the day of the Lord, we see in verse 19, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his covenant. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and earthquake and a great hail. Now notice you couldn't see God's face, but the temple of God was opened in heaven. That's why everyone on earth at the rapture, when the firmament is removed and the temple's visible, because we see here that 3.5 years after the rapture, the temple is still visible. The temple of God was opened, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his covenant. In other words, you could see the temple. It was visible. And then we see again later in chapter 15, and verse 5, it says, after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. Well, how would you know that unless you could see it? And it says in verse 8, the temple was filled with the smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Now, obviously, this tells you that the church is raptured already at this point, because it says no man. Now, it doesn't say no angel, it says no man was able to enter the temple. Okay, so in other words, the church was already raptured, and they were up before God's throne at the time of the rapture. And we can see that the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God. And at this time, no man was able to enter the temple till the 7 plagues of the last 7 angels were fulfilled. Now, it tells us in Revelation chapter 7, that at the time of the rapture, in verse 9, after this I beheld a multitude which no one could number, of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb. Notice the Lamb was not on earth reigning from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. No, he was in heaven. And the believers were all there. They were all there. All the people of all nations, not Jews, people of all nations, kindreds, peoples, and tongues. This is all the believers that just got raptured in chapter 6, verse 12. And they stood before the throne and before the Lamb. They stood before the throne. So that we see that all the believers were able to stand before God's throne in his temple, because they cried out, salvation belongs to a God who sits upon the throne and unto the Lamb. And describing these believers, it says in verse 14, one of the elders says, these are they which came out of great tribulation. That's not a 7-year tribulation. Once again, that's a time of tribulation that happens before the rapture, which is described for us plainly in the first 5 seals. But these are they that came out of the great tribulation, have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So obviously these are believers that just got raptured, that were standing before the throne in God's temple. And notice verse 15 says, therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. So his throne is in his temple. That's where his throne is. They stand before the throne of God. That's where the believers, this is talking about Christians, These are Christians who were made white in the blood of the Lamb. That's only Christians are made white in the blood of the Lamb. And they serve him day and night in his temple. And he that sits on the throne shall dwell among them. So this is believers after they got raptured. Then they can stand before God's throne. They are before the throne of God. And they serve him day and night in his temple. But it never says anywhere here that any living person ever saw God's face. That's why Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 says that Jesus is the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person, the exact representation, the express image of his person. And in John chapter 1, we see that in verse 14, Jesus was the Word made flesh. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And he was in the beginning with God. The Word, in the beginning was the Word. And remember, the Word is Jesus Christ. So the Word was with God and the Word was God. And the same was with God in the beginning. With God. So we see that he was God. He was part of the Godhead, but it was a separate person. So we could see Jesus Christ. He was a image that came to the earth to be seen. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. We saw his glory. And that was the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So we were able to see the glory of God in its best representation through Jesus Christ. Because according to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, that Jesus was the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person. So no one could see the face of God and live, but Jesus Christ was the express image of his person. So people could look at Jesus and live. So I just wanted to clarify that from last week because I got some questions on that. So thanks for watching.